Okay, welcome back. We talked briefly a bit how the internet works, and now we're going to talk a bit more about that. Now that we know how to start a basic Node application, we need to see what we actually want to do with this application. Obviously, we don't want to print things to the console. We want something more useful out of that. So let's go back to this diagram where we see the browser and the server. Now, what's not drawn here is obviously there is just a line connecting them, but we need to figure out how this connection is actually established. Now, this is the internet, right? This is the internet where your browser can connect to the server thanks to your internet connection. So if you don't have internet, you obviously cannot connect to the backend. But the internet is just a way to connect two computers. Now, the way that they actually exchange information comes a bit on top of that. So there is something extra on top of the wires and the Wi-Fi. And the way this actually works is that when there is a common language that both the browser and the server agree on beforehand, a common way to exchange information, which is called the protocol in a computer language, and this protocol is called an HTTP protocol. And this is the protocol that all the internet uses to exchange information. Now, you might have heard of some other protocols, and that's really good. Can you name a few other protocols? If you're now saying mail protocol or file transfer protocol, those are both correct. And these are protocols who have different uses. HTTP is a protocol for the internet for the purpose of showing websites. HTTP actually stands for Hypertext Transfer Protocol. So HTTP, yeah, I'm not gonna type that out. HTTP Hypertext Transfer Protocol. So hypertext refers to the way the data is sent. Basically, it is all just some text data. Transfer is obviously the action of sending the data around, and protocol is just a way for two entities to agree on something that they're going to use together. So that's the first term that I would like you to remember. I'm going to write it down here. That's HTTP. So both the server and the browser use HTTP to talk to each other. HTTP. Yeah. And the way they do this, when you open your browser and then you type something in the browser, yeah, so you type some google.com, then your browser sends a request to the server. So this is a request to the server, which says, hey server, can you get me the data for this website, which might be google.com or something similar. And then this request goes through HTTP, it goes to the server. The backend application or the server application receives this request. It has logic that knows how to process the request, maybe get some data from the database, and then puts all that information together and sends back a response to the browser. So this is a response. So maybe I need a line here. So the request goes from the browser to the server. The server processes the request and then sends back a response to the browser. Now the response is usually an HTML file, which basically tells you how the page should look like. Or it might be a JavaScript file that has some logic that changes something in the UI according to what the server sent back. Yeah. So that's basically how web applications work. Now, a few other important things to note is that, so I say here you type in something, and the thing that you type in, for example, google.com, that's called the URL. Okay, so another term that you need to remember is URL, right? So that's what you type in your browser. So that's here, right in your address bar. Imagine this is the address bar in your browser. Yeah? And that is how the browser knows which server to find. So based on the URL is in a way the address of the server that you want to find. Now you might have heard of IP addresses, uh, and these are, well, you can think of them as roughly the same thing. So a URL is usually connected to an IP address, to a server, and there is a special component in the internet that knows which URL is connected to which IP address, or in other words, which server. Now, the URL or the IP address, they are the address of the server, but actually the server, in addition to an address, has something which is called a port, and that's another term for you. So a lot of terms today to remember. Not all of them are equally important, but we're going to repeat them all the time so that you know all these terms, because these are important terms. So that's a port, and basically one server has many ports, and you can think of them as, if the IP address is the address of the whole building, then the port is like a number of apartment in that one big building, and a server has many different ports. For HTTP, uh, do you know what is the commonly used port for HTTP? If you are saying 80, that's really good. I'm really happy for you. So that's port 80. This is just by definition. You don't have to worry about this. When you type in a URL, you don't even see this, but actually a request is going to the server to port 80 by definition. Now, there are other ports which are default for other things. For example, FTP, I think is port 20 or 21, and so forth. But the one you should remember is port 80 for HTTP. So I think that covers most of the key components. Okay, one last part, that is about the response. And this is a lot now of information, but we're going to see all of this in practice in just a minute. One last thing that I want to say. So we said that HTTP is a hypertext transfer protocol, which basically means that all that it's sending out and sending back is just text. Now, and I just said that the response can sometimes be HTML, sometimes can be a JavaScript, can be a file, can be an image, can be anything, right? But it's all sent as text. So how does the browser know what type the response is? So is it an image or is it HTML? And the answer is, in the response, there is a special type of field which is called content type, which tells the browser what type of content is being sent. This is called content type. I'm gonna enlarge that for you, don't worry. Yeah. Content type, not content, content. Yeah. So content type, that is part of the response, and content type can be, for example, HTML or JavaScript and so forth, right? So and so forth. Okay, so that's a lot of theory. We're gonna jump into a real application now to see how this actually works with a real application. So I have here an app, a really nice, simple app. It has some text and some images, things like that. So I'm going to, for you, I have on the right side open the DevTools, and I have opened the Network tab, which shows all of these requests and responses going back and forth. This is a very useful tool when you want to later debug and see what is actually going on with your application. So if I open the page again by refreshing here, and I'm gonna expand this so that we see everything. Yeah, we see two requests going out. The first one is based on the URL, and the second one is an image that's being loaded, is being displayed on the page. Now, if I click on the first one, you will see here, this is the actual HTML that we got back as a response. Yeah. Now, if I go back here to the headers, now you can see some additional information. For example, and maybe you can already recognize some of the things that you saw on the previous page. So if I also expand here this part, now you should be able to see a lot of the information that I was talking about on the previous page. Take a moment to see if you can find recognize some things. Okay, so at the top here we have the request URL. This is basically the URL of the server that we are trying to access. Okay, now down here in the response, so this is general. Down here there says response, and here you see the content type, which in this case is text HTML. So this is all really useful things to know about. Now, I'm not sure if we can see the port. I don't think we can. No, nope, we cannot see the port. What else can we see here? Well, the length of the response is 309, and the actual response we can see here is just a text field. Yeah. Now, what you saw is that when this HTML was loaded, that's because I typed in the HTML here, pressed enter, and then the HTML is being loaded. But here you see there is another request that went out. So where does this request come from? Well, actually, when the browser receives this HTML, it starts reading it and processing it, and start drawing things on the page. So for example, H1 full stack example, yeah, that was displayed here. And everything is displayed, and then it reaches this part which says image. Now this image is not contained in the HTML, but actually it has an external source that it needs to where the image is located. Yeah. So now for the browser to be able to display this image, it needs to go and get that resource. And the only way that the browser knows how to load data is by sending out a request. And that's why you see here another request going out to get the image. Yeah. So let's open up this request. This request is, don't be confused by that, it's just that there is no data that you can see here because it's just image, there is no text. So let's jump here again in the general, and you see now the URL is slightly different. So it's the full stack example herokuapp.com, and now there is a slash kuva.png. So this is very important. So basically the first part of the URL, the part before the slash, that tells you what server you're talking to. Yeah, but everything after that is telling you about what you're trying to load. So in this case, we're trying to load a certain image, which is called kuva.png. In the previous case, we were just trying to load the default thing, which is the HTML. A real-life server will have a lot of different pages and images and resources that you can load from it, but they're all usually on the same server, and that's why the URL at the beginning is the same, and the only difference is the second part of the URL. Now, what's interesting here, maybe the response. Let's see what the response says. Content type, image, PNG. So you see that the content type depends on what is actually being sent, and see here the size of the image is rather bigger than the text. And there is a preview of the image, so it's just some different technologies. You're going to learn all of these technologies at Hack Your Future. So right now we are learning Node.js. Yep. Okay, I got distracted a bit there. The key point that I wanted to make is this whole interaction. So between the browser and the server. So the server, when you go to the browser and you type a URL and you press enter, then you see a request that gets some HTML. Based on that request, then the server, the browser is processing this request, and then when it needs more information or more resources like images or JavaScript, it will make other requests to get that data. And then based on that response, will populate the page. And it is possible, it happens a lot, that actually when you load some JavaScript, for example, that JavaScript will make another request to load even more data. So this is very common that you see, and it's this kind of train that you see here. If I look at the timeline, the waterfall here. Let me clear it up for you. So you see, first this request comes in, and then when it's finished, it's being processed, and then the browser figures out that it needs to send another request to get some data which it needs based on the previous request. Well, I think that's all for the first part. In the past, when we had lectures in the office, this would be now a time for a break. But just before we go there, I want to quickly go back and review everything that we covered. So HTTP is Hypertext Transfer Protocol. It's the way how all websites work. It's the protocol that they all use. By default, it uses port 80 to connect. You don't need to usually worry about this. This is all happening behind the scenes for you. The browser in the UI, when you type in a URL in the address bar, sends out an HTTP request to the server asking it for some information. The server processes that request and sends back a response. Now, based on the content type of the response, whether it's HTML or JavaScript, the browser knows what to do with the response. And maybe as a result of this first response, for example, if it's in HTML, there will come additional requests, and this will continue until all the data for a web page is loaded. So this request response can happen several times until everything is loaded, all the images are there, and then you can start interacting with the page. Well, I think that's all for today. Sorry, for now, and see you in after lunch.